kind of see which Stacey Ginsburg was this Hancock at the time. Uh, Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, back at you. Really one of my first videos for 2024. I know I did a previous one on the Rock and another previous one on the Chabad tunnels, but this is my third video for 2024, and big news for 2024, man. As we as we approach the the anniversary of it's already passed. It was January 11th, the anniversary of Monday Night Raw, January 11th, 1993. So this will be the 21st anniversary this past year, of Raw being on the air. Raw has now decided, the the executives at Ari Emanuel have decided to partner up with Netflix, and Netflix will rights to Monday Night Raw. So instead of the USA Network, you will have to, and having the USA Network and having cable and being able to watch Raw that way, you will now be able to watch Raw on a streaming service via Netflix, and it's an exclusive deal, guys. You know, so basically, once again, just like they did in uh, in the early 2000s, they're leaving the USA Network. They eventually were there from like 2000 to 2005, and then 2005 they came back home to the USA Network, and they've been there ever since. USA Network has been the home of the WWE's content since the early 1980s. Remember, it was Tully Blanchard's company was the first company, Southwest Championship Wrestling, to feature wrestling on the USA Network. But because of the incident during a match where somebody flung feces at another person, the network executives said, no, we're canceling this. And then that's when they went with Vince McMahon, who was, before that, he was on WKOR. And for a while, he was on, content was on HBO. They went with Vince McMahon, and initially he did the All American Wrestling, where he would showcase talent from around the world in different territories. It was basically not just his territory, but all territories really. And then he did the Tuesday Night Titans thing. And then from there in the mid to late 80s, he went to Primetime Wrestling. And then finally, Primetime Wrestling ends in 1992, 93, and we get right into Monday Night Raw, which has been the staple of his company since forever. So, and in January 11th, like I said, 1993, that was the first Raw, and it was on the USA Network, and it was the really first primetime wrestling show where they showed live wrestling. Uh, for the WWF, because people will come into the comment section and say, "Well, Jay, that's not true because WCW Saturday Night showed live wrestling, Mid South Wrestling showed live wrestling, other promotions." I'm talking about for the WWF, their syndicated programming, whether Wrestling Challenge, Superstars, or Primetime Wrestling, or All American Wrestling on Sundays, because then All American Wrestling was then moved to Sundays, right? It was canned stuff, things that they had done at the house shows, for example. It wasn't live wrestling. Vince McMahon famously hated studio wrestling, but Raw was initially a studio wrestling show in the Manhattan Center. It wasn't until later on in 93 and the early part of 94 when they really took the show on the road. Look at my 1994 year in review. So, once again, just like WWE did in uh, 2014 when they launched the WWE Network, just like they did in 2021 when they partnered up with Peacock. Once again, and just like they did last year when they merged the two sports entertainment conglomerates of themselves and the UFC, they're looking at the future. and they know that television is dying. Terrestrial television is dying. People aren't watching TV anymore. And if they are watching TV, they're watching on a smart TV with apps like Netflix, Hulu, and other apps. So that's why their ratings are low. So they want to fix this. They want to partner up with one of the biggest streaming giants, perhaps the biggest streaming giant, the most well known streaming giant in the game, Netflix. So Netflix now and WWE and Monday Night Raw are now a tag team. What can you say? This is big news for us as wrestling fans. I, for the longest, I don't really have cable, so I can't really watch um, Raw or SmackDown. Right? SmackDown's on USA too, because remember they were on Fox in 2019. Network television, everybody had that. Anybody could have watched that. You know what I mean? But Fox wants them off because of low ratings, so they're moving back to USA. So I don't know now. Fox will be on USA. I mean, SmackDown will be on USA, and Raw will be on Netflix. I don't know. You know, but obviously, if that's the case, then Raw's going to be back to being the A show. You know, Raw's going to be the show that the biggest talent in the company are put on. The Roman Reigns, the Bianca Belairs, the Becky Lynches, the Cody Rhodes, the CM Punks, uh, the people that they really want you to pay attention to. They're going to be on Raw, and the jabronis are going to be on SmackDown. Okay, another thing I wanted to talk about. 40 years ago today, January the 23rd, 1984, something happened in the world of professional wrestling, particularly in the world of the WWE. Hulk Hogan, the immortal Hulk Hogan, what you gonna do, brother, arrived in Madison Square Garden. Now, this wasn't his official return. He had returned a couple of months later. Because keep in mind, he'd been in the company. First came to the WWE in 1979 as a heel, right? Managed by classy Freddie Blassie. He came over from Memphis. Remember, I said that in my Jerry Jarrett tribute video last year that it was Jerry Jarrett in the late 70s who introduced him and gave him the name Hulk. Well, once he made it big in Jerry Jarrett's territory, he was discovered by Gerald Briscoe, who was close with him, was actually the guy when Jerry was down in Florida, who convinced Hulk to get back into wrestling and go hook up with Eddie Graham, right? Jerry, both Briscoes, Jerry and Jack. So anyway, now he's in the WWF and he's a heel. They're basically making him cannon fodder for Andre the Giant, the big Showdown and Shea program in 1980 as the double main event. It's him and Andre the Giant, as a semi double main event, um, opening up for basically Bruno Sammartino's retirement match against his former protege Larry Zbyszko. Right, famous cage match in Shea Stadium, 1980. So he's there from 1970 to 1980. Doesn't really do much. Only was being fed to Andre the Giant because they had some previous altercations in Southeastern. Right, they even had an arm wrestling match when Hogan was in Southeastern working for the Fullers. So. And the size of Hogan, it was naturally that his opponent will be Andre the Giant. So anyway, he's there as a heel, and they don't. After the match is over and Andre beats him, they don't really know what else they're gonna do with him. But at the same time, Sylvester Stallone is looking. Sylvester Stallone is 3 years before that. 4 years before that had just made Rocky One, and Rocky One was a huge success. 1976. Then he comes out with Rocky 2 in 1979, another huge success. During that time, in between that time, in 1978, Sylvester Stallone worked closely with Terry Funk in a wrestling themed movie called Paradise Alley, in which Stallone directed. So Stallone is asking Terry Funk, does he know any wrestlers that will be interested in playing the part of Thunderlips in the upcoming Rocky movie? Because they wanted to spoof, uh, again, draw inspiration. The inspiration for Rocky is a man named Chuck Webner, who in 1976 had an exhibition fight with Muhammad Ali, and he actually knocked down Muhammad Ali. But also in 1976, when Vince McMahon was involved with this, Japanese promoters and American promoters that were promoting Muhammad Ali had a boxer versus wrestler match. And it was at Shea Stadium. It was the second showdown at Shea, not the one that Hogan was in, but the second one, where Bruno Sammartino came back after having a broken neck and he wrestled Stan Hansen. But the undercard for this featured Chuck Webner, the Bayonne Bleeder, with whom Rocky is based on, in a boxer versus wrestler match with Andre the Giant. So Stallone wanted to parody this, so he needed a wrestler, right? So one of his agents, Peter Young, was a wrestling fan. He knew about Hulk Hogan. He saw Hulk Hogan in Madison Square Garden. He's like, get Hogan. They contact Terry Funk, who knew Hogan from Japan. So Hogan decides, I'm going to do this movie. He tells Vince Sr. about it. Vince Sr. is still in charge of WWE at this point. He didn't sell. He didn't sell. This is like 81, 80, 81. He tells he didn't sell the company until 82 to his son. He tells Vince Sr. about it. Vince Sr. says absolutely not. You're either a wrestler or you're an actor. You can't be both, right? You can't mix the two. So Hogan says, "Fuck it. I'm gonna do this movie. I'm gonna take this money and I'm gonna do the movie with Stallone, and I'm gonna leave this company." And Vince Sr. says, if you leave this company, you will never be able to come back into this company ever again. Hogan leaves the company. For The movie comes out. Greg and Vern Gagne hear about Hulk Hogan. They want to bring him in. Stupidly, they think their formula that he was doing in the WWF could work in AWA this time, like with a manager. So they bring him in with Johnny Valiant, right, as his manager and his mouthpiece. And the way they bring him in was interesting because he's like the character in Thunderlips, right? He's brash, he's talking shit, you know what I mean? But you can't see his face. All you can see is his back. And they build him not only from Venice Beach, but they build him from New York City because that's just the territory that he just came from. And they tried so hard to make him a heel, but the movie hit. The movie hit in such a way that this movie made Mr. T an icon and made Hulk Hogan an icon. So now he has to turn he has to turn babyface. They want him as a heel in the AWA, but they're cheering him no matter everywhere he goes. He got this thing where the High Flyers, Jim Brunzell and Greg Gagne, tear his shirt off, right, in the six-man tags. And there's no copyright at that time, so they start to play um, Eye of the Tiger around the arenas, and the place is going crazy. He's selling his merch. And of course, Vern Gagne is seeing this and he wants a piece of his merch, especially Hogan's doing Japan deals. And over there in Japan, as Ichiban, that was his nickname. Over there in Japan, Hogan is even bigger than he is in the United States, right? But Vern Gagne wants a piece of this. Plus, uh, Hogan is working closely with Antonio Inoki, who's the rival of Giant Baba, with whom Vern has a deal. So, but Vern really doesn't care. He just wants a piece of Hogan's merch, and Hogan's not doing it. So Vern, in turn, is not going to put the belt on Hogan. He's a number one contender. He's feuding with Nick Bockwinkel, managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan at that time, and it comes to a head at Super Sunday, 1983. Lord James Blear is a famous wrestler from the Pacific, Polynesian Pro Wrestling, South Pacific territory, is the manager, and everything's going pretty well. Hogan wins, but earlier in the match he threw Nick Bockwinkel over the top rope. So they review the tape, and It's a disqualification, and the decision is reversed. That's the last straw for Hogan. Finally, Vince McMahon Jr. is in charge of the company. He's contact. He doesn't have the same feelings as his dad. His dad would pretty much pass away not too long after, and he's bought out the company from the other shareholders that have been the shareholders since the '70s, like Arnold Scullin, like Gorilla Monsoon, like um, Phil Zacco. These guys, after Tootsman left the company in '71, they bought out his share, and they were basically the shareholders. Vince bought them all out, and he has new plans. He wants to go national, right? But he needs a star. His champion right now at this point in 1983 is Bob Backlund. Bob Backlund is not going to do it. Backlund is barely selling out Madison Square Garden, their biggest arena, right? So he needs somebody else. So he calls Hogan. First, he devised a plan for Backlund to lose the championship. So uh, the Iron Sheik, who's a heel, like I said, who has mega heat, tons of heat in the mid '80s because of the Iran hostage situation. And he's coming out praising Ayatollah Khomeini. He's coming out talking about death to America, Iran number one. Like Iran was our number one enemy after the ascension of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the establishment of the Islamic Republic and what they did with the hostage situations, holding it for so many days, right? So the Iron Sheik's heat is nuclear. So they want anybody to beat him. So he puts Backlund in the camel clutch. Backlund's in so much pain. Backlund's manager, Arnold Scullin, throws in the towel. So Backlund never gives up. Now, Hulk Hogan had already come back a couple of weeks before that. Hulk Hogan, Backlund was being beat down by the Wild Samoans. Yes, Roman Reigns' father and uncle. And Hogan saves him. And he gets on the microphone after it's over, Backlund does, and says, I know what you guys think. This guy was here with Freddie Blassie. He was one of the most dastardly heels, in the New York City area, but he's changed. He's turned over a new leaf. So he gives his endorsement. Now, kayfabe, then Jack Tunney had just become the kayfabe president of the United States. Of the WWF. Prior to that, it was Shashi Hiroshima, right? So one of his first announcements was, since Backlund couldn't make it for the rematch because he was injured, Hogan would take his place. So on January 23rd, 1984, Hulk Hogan took his place and defeated the Iron Sheik. The Iron Sheik obviously was a transitional champion, and Lord Alfred Hayes and Gorilla Monsoon were on the call, and I'll never forget what Gorilla Monsoon said in that match. He said, Hulkamania is here. And indeed it was. And so for the next 9 years, on and off sometimes, because he would go to do movies and they would let Randy Savage hold it, or he would or they let the Ultimate Warrior hold it for on and off for the next 8 years. Hulk Hogan would be the dominant force within the World Wrestling Federation. And with that, Vince McMahon would build his company around him. Vince McMahon would go national. Vince McMahon would go into all these other territories. Because keep in mind, before Hulk Hogan arrived in the WWF, the only territory that Vince had gone into really was the Los Angeles territory of Mike and Gene LaBelle, which was already on its last legs. They weren't doing anything really. The Los Angeles territory had really peaked in 1957 with the Baron Leone Lou Thesz match at Olympic Auditorium, and somewhat in the '70s with Coach John Tolos and Freddie Blassie having the first closed circuit match. There's kind of a renaissance, and even with Bearcat Wright in the mid '60s and '70s. But the height of the Los Angeles territory was uh, Baron Leone versus Luthez in 1957. Los Angeles was was a great wrestling town in the sense as far as you could go there and you could get the fundamentals, for example, because it's Judo Gene LaBelle. Come on, one of the greatest shooters of all time in wrestling. But anyway, okay, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah, my bad, guys. It was 1952. That was the match between Baron Leone and Luthez. That was big in Los Angeles. But the point is that Los Angeles dying out. You had the Destroyer Dick Beyer. You had a Frankenstein wrestler like in '82, and Hugh Nichols was no longer there. Mike and Gene LaBelle were looking to get out the game, so Vince McMahon from New York buys them out. Then he goes to try and buy out other territories. When he gets to Ohio, man, Ohio seems like a dead territory too because um, everybody that was associated with it, for example, like Johnny Powers, right, was no longer in the business. You know what I mean? Sheik had run it for a while. Sheik's territory in Detroit was completely destroyed. So Vince thought this is open season, but Georgia Championship Wrestling from 1973, like we talked about, they had their own cable feed, so they went not just in the Southeast, but all around the country. So they already were running with Ole Anderson at the helm and my boy Jim Barnett already at the helm. They were running, they were already running shows in Akron, Ohio. You know what I mean? They were already running shows in Cleveland. They were already running shows in Dayton, in all those Cleveland towns. You know what I mean? So Vince was blocked out from that. And that, of course, began the rivalry with Vince and Georgia Championship Wrestling that would inevitably lead him to buy Georgia in 1984 when Jack Briscoe, when the Briscoe brothers and Jim Barnett, because he and Jim Barnett would leave the end of he and Jim Barnett, he Vince McMahon and Jim Barnett would leave the NWA in in 1983, the following year, with Jim Barnett selling his share of Georgia Championship Wrestling and going to work for Vince. And everybody sold their share of Georgia Championship Wrestling except Ole, but Ole was the odd man out, and Vince eventually owned Georgia, and we know how the fans reacted. And then he had to sell Georgia to Jimmy Crockett for $1 million, and that was the beginning of the Crockett McMahon Wars. And then Crockett himself had to sell in '88 to Turner, and then Turner had to sell in 2001. But anyway, that was the significance of WrestleMania 27, in my opinion, in 2011, of WWE actually coming to Georgia and running a WrestleMania in Georgia. All that history. But yeah, this was the beginning of Hulkamania in the WWE. And it's funny because on Raw last night they teased that Hogan might be in the Royal Rumble. You know, the Hulkster, he's been doing pretty good, man. I mean, we all know about what happened to him in 2015. You know, no need to rehash that. You know what I mean? His lies from several years before that exposed his racism, the thing with Heather Clem and Bubba the Love Sponge. But I think over the years after that's happened, he's come back at the Saudi Arabia shows. He's hosted two WrestleManias, 35 and 37 respectively. I think fans have forgiven the Hulkster. You know what I mean? And they're ready to take him back. What he means to the WWE. Had he not come to had Vern Gagne given him the AWA championship, and he'd have never come to the WWE, I don't think the WWE would have been as powerful. I mean, like we said, they were looking at Kerry Von Erich. Uh, they were looking at Dusty Rhodes. Dusty wasn't going to go to Dusty wasn't going to go to New York. He just left Florida to go to Crockett and to sign a deal with Crockett in '83 to be Crockett's booker. Even though he wasn't featured on the first Starrcade, he didn't book on the first Starrcade. He was in the back. He already had inked it with Crockett that he was going to be his next booker because Crockett's previous booker, George Scott, had gone to the WWF. So Dusty wasn't going to do it. Kerry Von Erich wasn't going to do it because Kerry Von Erich, loyal to his father, we saw in the Iron Claw movie, Fritz, in the early days, in from the time that they had the hot angle with the Freebirds, Fritz Von Erich, in the movie we saw it, the Iron Claw. Anybody that watched that movie, Fritz Von Erich, he wasn't gonna let none of his boys leave the nest. Maybe David to go down to Florida a little bit to work for Eddie Graham and to become a heel and to become seasoned. But as far as Vince McMahon wanted to sign people to exclusive contracts, Vince McMahon even wanted to buy out World Class Championship Wrestling because he was featuring them on the All American show. Remember, I said one of the first shows on the USA Network that they had, in the early '80s. So he was interested in the Von Erich boys. And then when David Von Erich died, they announced it on the loudspeaker at Madison Square Garden. But Fritz wasn't going to let them sign full-time deals at all, guys. So Kerry Von Erich was out of the picture. And a little while after that, Kerry Von Erich would win the NWA championship in Texas Stadium from Ric Flair. So he was out of it. the people that they had in house, of course, like I said, Backlund wasn't going to work because he was too bland and boring. Jimmy Superfly Snuka was pretty over. But one of the things, he didn't have promo skills because remember, that's why they brought him in initially from the Carolinas with a manager. And he had the Nancy Argentina thing where he actually was convicted of murder and Vince tried to cover it up. But but anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out. I'm doing my Royal Rumble predictions pretty soon. My prediction is going to be, um, well, you got to wait to watch that video. Peace. Love you guys.
Still, thank y'all for seeing my background. It's right over the fucking floor. I hate this count.